Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and we're back after quite a long hiatus, but I thought I'd come back with a quick little video, sort of throwing my hat into the ring of TrekTube a little bit, as I've seen doing the rounds on TrekTube and Star Trek channels. There's been a lot of talk about the Klingon Bird of Prey, particularly after the Discovery Bird of Prey, which was done by Trek Yards and Law Reloaded, who did his own analysis of the Bird of Prey. Quite controversial, I think. So yes, what I'm going to be really addressing is the old size problem of the Bird of Prey, which is familiar to a lot of us, and really kind of justify it from a lore perspective. As well as, obviously practical reasons. So let's get into it. So the first time we see the Klingon Bird of Prey as we know it is in Star Trek 3 Search for Spock, and in that it's meant to be scaled at about 110 meters. So that gives us a good bearing, and if you think about it, compare in terms of the lore, compared to its previous iterations, i.e. that of Enterprise, where it's more of a gunboat, as well as actually Discovery, which isn't too bad either, although the aesthetic is a completely different thing that we won't get into. So it's about the right size. This is an established size for birds of prey, as a sort of a hit-and-run raider that uses cloaking tactics. And then pretty much throughout all of the original series films, I think it's fairly consistent. A lot of the time, though, we don't really see it, but it doesn't feel like in any of them it's particularly distinct, that there are any significant size inconsistencies. They all feel about the same for what we see. Then we get into the Next Generation era, and now this is where things start getting a bit strange. If we look at Next Generation, A Matter of Honor, this is taken from Ex Astris Scientia's article. He suggests it's a length of about 230. And while on screen I think that's probably true, I think the way it's portrayed in the episode, how small the Bird of Prey is, I think perhaps actually suggests we're looking more at a traditional length, but it doesn't really matter. Later in Next Generation, in the Defector, they say they look to a bit bigger, about almost 600 meters in the Defector. I think this is an exaggerated shot, personally. I do think it's, due to camera angles and such. I don't actually think, because apart from this, there's no other evidence to suggest that this is a canon size. Then we go to yesterday's Enterprise. Now they suggest, now again, Ex Astris Scientia says that's probably about 350 meters in length. That is quite big. Again, we go to Reunion compared to the Vocha, and you're looking at again 320, and pretty much throughout the rest of Next Generation, it's I think about 300 odd meters. Then when we get to Deep Space Nine, we're of course basically reintroduced to the Burrell class, being quite small, at about 110 meters again. So obviously we know the real world reasons for it. It's because when Next Generation started, they didn't think it was going to last, so when they were a bit hesitant to create new Klingon ship models. But also it's a way of kind of reassuring the audience that these still are the same Klingons that we know from the original series and the films, that this follows on from that. rather than doing a complete visual reboot of them like Discovery did. So you hear a lot of people complaining about it, but you know if we just started out with a Vocha, I think a lot of people would be like, nah, that might just be me. But then with regard to its justification from the lore perspective, right, so at the end of, so basically throughout all the original series era, we can see the 110-meter bird of prey. I think no one's got a problem with that. It makes sense as a hit and run attack ship, complementing the D7 and, well, by then the Katinga class, which is still larger. And bear in mind, it was probably built before we see it in Search for Spock, designed most likely to go up against the Constitution refit. I don't see any problem with that. I think it fits very well. However, you get to the last original series movie, the Final Frontier. No, it's not that. That's terrible. The Undiscovered Country, in which we learn the Klingons have a terrible ecological disaster, and basically their civilization is going to collapse unless the Federation step in and give them things like industrial replicators, which I think is quite key, is these industrial replicators. Okay, so, you have that. The Klingon Bird of Prey is the most advanced ship of the time. Might not be the biggest, but it is probably the most advanced, technologically speaking. And then the Klingons start seeing stuff like the Excelsior, and more as they go into the last years of the 23rd century and the early 24th century, the Excelsior becomes more and more prevalent. And if you just look at, in terms of size comparison, there's not a Klingon ship that really, from that era, that could hold a light to the Excelsior. It's just vastly bigger and, ahead of its time, and ahead of the Klingon fleet. So, clearly what they had was inadequate. Particularly when you think about it, it gets into the, you get more Excelsiors, and then we'll call it Wolf 359 or pre-TNG era, where you have things like the Ambassador and the Chien and the New Orleans and the Niagara, stuff like that. Then your Klingon birds of prey really start looking inadequate in terms of size. But it's a very resource-intensive process to build an entirely new ship class. You have to design it, you have to research it, all these things, go into developing it, and that takes time and money, things that the Klingon Empire at that time did not really have. Therefore, clearly I think the best solution is to basically take a pre-existing class and refit it for your needs. So that way they actually had something that could maybe hold a light to stuff like the Excelsior. So that's, I think, where the Cavort came from. And personally, in terms of the size of Cavort class, I'm fine with either the 300 meters or 230, probably somewhere around the middle, I'd say. Just 300 meters takes it a bit too close to being the same size as the Vocha for my liking. But it would be employed then as a sort of a defensive cruiser. Mark you not a good one. No one ever said the Cavort class was good, because we basically never see it in action, and I think we can say that the ending in yesterday's Enterprise is incredibly exaggerated in terms of the strength of the Cavort class. But I think it was a stopgap. It was a stopgap before they had things like the Vocha and the Negva. So to say that it doesn't really make sense from a lore perspective, I think it does make sense from a lore perspective. It's that whole Klingons, if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. And it really, you see it with a lot of stuff, even in the modern world. You look at aircraft, particularly. the Americans are still and the Russians are still flying respectively the B-52 and the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, aircraft that are from back in the 1950s. They still use them today, in sort of the same roles, but they are sort of slightly applied differently. And I think it's that kind of thing. You have a ship that was intended as a hit-and-run scout, and then is taken up to size to basically be a light cruiser. No one's going to say it was a good light cruiser. I don't think it was, but I think it was all they had at the time. So yeah, and then other but if you go up then to the 700-meter one, I think real technical questions start arising, like, actually, is that wing inhabitable? Is that not like 2 decks or something ridiculous? And I think that does take it a bit far. So yeah, I think I'm happy to accept a Cavort and a Burrell, and I think the on-screen evidence clearly demonstrates that. In terms of what happened to the Cavort during Deep Space Nine, we can probably say they scrapped them in favour of the Voyager. Because the Voyager is better, they probably use some of the same parts. They use some of the same materials to make the Voyager. But definitely, it's fair to say that, considering the position the Klingon Empire was in, as portrayed in the Undiscovered Country, it's not unreasonable to say that they would create a ship like the Cavort as a stopgap measure to try and keep pace with the rapidly advancing Starfleet. So for that reason, I think that the 2 sizes is perfectly acceptable in law and can be justified. And it's not a case, I think, in places it perhaps is a case of J.J. Abrams-esque misscaling, but overall I think it's fairly consistent and makes sense within the law as laid out within Star Trek The Undiscovered Country. So thank you guys for listening. This has been Venom Geek Media, and I will see you guys in the next video.